Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first ETTG OECD webinar. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. My name is Vera Mazzara, and I'm very honored to welcome you to this first webinar on the role of multilateral development finance in response to COVID-19. I'm the coordinator of the European Think Tanks Group, which is providing the expertise for this webinar today. ETTG is a network of 5 leading European think tanks. We have the European Centre for Development Policy Management, ECDPM, ODI, Overseas Development Institute, the French Institute for Sustainable Development and International Affairs, the Italian Institute for International Affairs, and the German Development Institutes. 2 housekeeping remarks for you. Please stay muted as you are. If you have issues or questions, you can write them in the chat on the right side of your screen. Then second thing, this webinar is recorded. You will access the video through our ETTG website. And if you are there, please also subscribe to our newsletter so you can be informed of other events of this kind. Without further ado, let me introduce you the panelists today. We have OECD, which is represented by Olivier Cattaneo, Head of Unit in Policy Analysis, Strategy, Development Cooperation Directorate. He will be accompanied by Abdoulaye Fabregas and Sien Kim. DIE will be represented by Max Otto Baumann, Senior Researcher of the Inter and Transnational Cooperation Program at DIE. Sam Bilal, Head of Program Trade, Investment and Finance Team at ECDPM. Then Annalisa Pritzon, Senior Research Fellow at the Development and Public Finance Program of ODI. And finally, Fabrizio Botti, Senior Fellow in Economics Finance at the Italian Institute of International Affairs. The debate today will be moderated by Maria Alejandra Riano, Research Fellow for the implementation of Agenda 2030 at the IDRI, Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. So I wish you a successful conversation, and Maria, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vera. Now we are going to start with our first session, and I would like to give the floor to Olivier Cattaneo, that, as Vera said, is the Unit Policy Analysis and Strategy of the Development Cooperation Directorate at the OECD. Olivier, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Maria and Vera, for the kind introductions. And as was mentioned, today we are launching our Multilateral Development Finance Report, and 2 lead authors are with us, Abdu and June, will present the content. But I just wanted to say a quick word about this series of webinars, and thanks ETTG for hosting us today. As we are going into confinement again in France, I mean, it's good to travel another time in 4 capitals of Europe in one session. Just to say, we started this series, I mean, during the week, I mean, kicking off in Paris at the OECD with our Secretary General, and then moving to Clermont-Ferrand in France. Then we went to Dakar with also panelists from Islamabad, Colombo, Kathmandu. Then we went yesterday to Washington. This morning we were in Stockholm and Bonn. Tomorrow we are going to Beijing, and next week we continue with Lusaka and New York. So as you see, all that with no carbon footprint, and so there is a good side to the confinement after all. And so I'm very excited to be today because it's already exciting to write a report, but now thanks to those exchanges and gaining all those perspectives from around the world, I think it makes it even more exciting. And usually, I mean, when you launch a report, it's the end of the story. But in this case, actually, I mean, with these new communities that we are building all together, I think it's the beginning of a story. And I'm so glad that we are all together to share perspectives on this topic, and that we'll continue to work for future editions and for future research altogether. So now I hand the floor to Abdou to please start with the presentation of the report, and thanks again to our hosts.
Thank you very much, Olivier. So let me share my screen. All right. So yes, very happy to be able to share a couple of insights from our reports around three key questions. One, how was the multilateral development system doing before the crisis? Two, how has it responded to the crisis? And three, how can we equip the system to respond to future challenges? So already before the crisis, the trends showed that the multilateral development system was growing in importance as a channel of development cooperation. What we saw in our analysis, and we can see it here on the left-hand side, is that funding to the multilateral development system had been increasingly growing and steadily growing. And so we can see that even it was also increasing at a faster pace than bilateral aid. In terms of multilateral channels, and that's more on the right-hand side, we see that the World Bank and the UN remain the two pillars of the system, even though in recent years, since 2015 approximately, they were competing more and more for funds with other type of organizations, in particular other multilateral development banks, but also vertical funds. Now, this growth of funding towards the multilateral system was mostly driven by increased earmarked contributions. And one thing that we found quite interesting is that we could see that in relative terms, earmarked contributions seem to have increased at the expense of bilateral aid, which is in yellow on the left-hand side, and not so much as we could have thought at the expense of core contributions. In fact, core contributions that we can see in dark blue have remained quite constant over the years at around 27, 28%. Another interesting highlight is that this growth also comes with an evolution of the funding base of the multilateral development system, and in particular with the growth of non-traditional donors. And I'd like to bring your attention in particular on the right-hand side to the sixth top contributor to the United Nations Development System, which is NGOs and other private actors, because these have been growing quite a lot. At least in some organizations, they represent a large part of the funding that's made available to multilateral channels. Now we can ask ourselves the question, what explains the growth of the multilateral system and what explains the appetite of donors for multilateral channels? And part of the response has to do with what donors think they can get from the multilateral system. So first, multilateral organizations are still perceived as an effective channel of development cooperation. We can see on the left-hand side the results of the latest GPEDC monitoring round that show that multilateral partners outperform bilateral ones across most indicators of development effectiveness. I think the exception is predictability. So first, development effectiveness. Second, multilateral organizations also have comparative advantages that donors may want to leverage. And so what we can see on the right-hand side here is that, for example, if you're looking to support fragile contexts, maybe the UN would be a good partner. If you're looking for specialization, then maybe vertical funds are the appropriate partner. But if you are looking for scale, then maybe MDBs are the way to go. Now, quite paradoxically, while the system is growing in importance, there is also increased stress on the system. And this has been caused both by growing needs and expectations that are placed on the system. And obviously the COVID-19 crisis adds to these needs, but also by internal tensions. One of these tensions comes from the evolution of the system itself. And in the report, we show that new multilateral entities have been created over time in successive waves. First, the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions, then the regional development banks in the 70s, following the decolonization processes. Later on, the vertical funds, coinciding with the awakening to global challenges, for example, the climate change, and more recently, new development banks such as AIIB or the new development banks, the BRIC banks. And this has created a sense of growing complexity of the system and also of growing fragmentation of the multilateral development system. Another tension is created by the type of funding that donors provide to multilateral organizations. And over the years, what we see in our analysis is that the volume of funding has steadily increased, but at the same time, the quality of these contributions that we measured here as the share of core funding received by the multilateral system has been decreasing quite rapidly. And this brings us to ask ourselves whether we're going towards a multilateral system a la carte. By this, what we mean is a system where decisions would be taken not so much based on consensus among its members, but rather where members cherry pick, what topic, what sector, what countries they want to fund. One particular implication of this trend has to do with the funding vulnerability of multilateral organizations. And so we did a little mapping as part of our analysis to see where multilateral organizations are on this chart based on two things. One is the level of concentration of their donor base, and the other one is the level of non-core funding or earmarked funding that they receive. And based on this, we see that several UN entities appear quite vulnerable. The WHO, which is one of the 4 or 5 entities that you can see in the upper right quadrant, is a particularly interesting case. We know that the WHO has been in the news recently. And also one thing that we found interesting is that looking at its donor base, we see that, you have several donors that are very important, such as the US, but also private actors. And in fact, with the announcement of the withdrawal of the US from WHO, it would leave this public health organization with a private actor, the Gates Foundation, as its top funder. And so we think that this is also something that requires the attention of the multilateral community. And with this, I'll hand over to my colleague June, who will talk about multilateral outflows and about the role of the multilateral system in the current crisis.
Thank you, Abdul. So looking a bit at the outflows, we can see on the left-hand side that the recent increase in outflows has been mainly driven by increase in MDB funding, including from the World Bank Group. On the right-hand side, you can see that this has shifted the balance between concessional and non-concessional finance towards more non-concessional finance, which is mainly provided by MDBs. The next slide, please. Yes, and with this, there has also been an increasing focus on middle-income countries, and at the same time, the share of LDCs and other low-income countries has been declining. But it has to be noted that this trend has been mainly driven by the reclassification of countries from low-income towards middle-income status. So this suggests that multilateral development finance, its composition, and the modalities used to deploy the funds have been adapting to changes in the income level of recipient countries, and therefore also the changes in potentially in the demands for financing from these countries. The next slide, please. And in terms of the SDGs that are targeted, you can see that multilateral development finance spans the whole spectrum with all 17 SDGs, but there are clear favorites. So especially 7, 8, and 9 you can see. And these are energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. And these are the priority areas of MDBs. So here again, we can observe that there's a clear weight of MDBs in the overall picture. The next slide, please. So having looked a bit at the performance of multilateral development finance, the priority areas, and also some of the factors that put the system under stress. We now want to see how this all comes into play in the current COVID context and beyond. And in the report, we do not really go into too much detail about this, mainly because we do not really have the data yet to have a deep dive and do an in-depth analysis. But what we see on the next slide, please. What we could observe already is that a large majority of the financing that has been made immediately available to developing countries has been channeled through the multilateral system. So we're talking about 250 billion of multilateral development finance for those countries. And this speaks to the ability of multilateral development finance to quickly and flexibly deploy large-scale funding. And we also ran a survey with DAC member countries, and you can see here that we asked them how they perceive the multilateral system is responding to the crisis. And you can see that the responses have been overall very positive. The only areas where DAC members would want more action from multilaterals is, for example, in the support for social protection schemes. On the next slide, however, DAC members have also pointed out some weaknesses and systemic limitations. And these include, for example, the lack of financial resources and the lack of coordination among member countries. And interestingly, these factors are exogenous factors. So it's something that has to be addressed by donors rather than the multilateral development organizations themselves. And this leads us to our final slide. So this is an outline of the reform and research agenda that we propose in the report. And this consists of 6 building blocks, which span all stages of multilateral development finance, including inflows and outflows. And it also involves the collective efforts of all stakeholders within and outside of the system. And we know that many of the topics here have already been picked up and studied in depth by colleagues from ETTG members. And this is why we are very much looking forward to the discussion today. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Max Otto from DIE.
Yeah, thank you, and hello to everybody. Let me start by congratulating you on the new report. It really provides a comprehensive and nuanced picture of the funding of multilateral organizations, and I particularly like the term multilateralism a la carte. So I understand in your analysis we are not yet there, but if you look at the UN specifically, I think we already might have multilateralism a la carte. So what I will do in my short input is I'll pick up some key observations from the report and then comment on them from the perspective of our own research here at the German Development Institute. We have a small UN research project led by my colleague Silke Weinlich, who spoke on another webinar earlier this day. And over the last few years, we have been focusing on earmarked funding. So, and from this research on earmarking emerged 3 issues which I think are relevant for today's topic and which I want to expand on a bit. So first, how earmarking affects, if not to say reduces development effectiveness. Second, how earmarking pushes the UN to downstream functions and away from policy advice, upstream work. And third, how earmarking has become a systemic feature of UN development cooperation. So all 3 issues, I think, are relevant when the question is how the UN and its funding can be adjusted to help countries build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic. And the term building back better is the UN's guiding principle for responding to the crisis. It means tackling root causes such as inequality, making societies more resilient, and returning them to a path to the SDGs. So for all of that, I think the UN needs to better exploit its potential as a multilateral organization, and I will try to show how this, what this involves when it comes to earmarking. So to start, we need to acknowledge that earmarking is quite a topic in the UN. 80% of voluntary contributions are, approximately 80% are earmarked currently. And that is much higher level than in the World Bank. So in the UN and the World Bank, earmarking is still complementary to the core funding, but in the UN, it has really been defining how the UN operates. And the result is probably what you call multilateralism a la carte. Another nice term which I heard from Achim Steiner, the UNDP head, is a supermarket. So the UN as a supermarket where both donors but also recipient countries buy what they want. And such a system can still be efficient, can still be accountable, but it's very far from the idea of multilateral action towards globally shared goods. So if I could add my own metaphor, I would like earmarking or earmark contributions to sugar. So they give the UN really a boost. They are a temptation both for donors and for UN organizations, but they also have harmful side effects. And earmarking has led to a resource-heavy way of working. It has led to a donor-oriented way of working, when the definition of multilateralism is much more about the coordination of political will. So I want to share 3 issues from our research on earmarking that explain these concerns with earmarking a little bit more. First, as I said, earmarking really is an effectiveness issue. And to start, let me quote from the report. It says, development effectiveness remains at the core of the multilateral value proposition. That is certainly true, but in the current reform discourse, at least in the UN, earmarking has so far not really been framed as an effectiveness issue, at least not with the required force and clarity. So for sure, earmarking troubles UN administration with fragmentation, inefficiencies, competition, and so. But my impression is that donors don't really care about this. What they should care about is that earmarking really hurts the UN's value proposition. So one aspect here is obviously the flexibility required both globally and at the country level to allocate resources selectively to priorities that can also shift. And that means that core funding are still the most important funding, is still the most important funding for crisis, for the COVID crisis and any other crisis to come. The other aspect, and on this I've focused a bit more on my research, is that earmarking pushes the UN to focus on quick and tangible resources, when actually what we need is the more long-term orientation on systemic change. And I mean, there are a number of UN evaluations from the field level that speak to that. There was an UNDP meta-evaluation from 2018 that found that among the biggest hindrances to systemic sustainable impact are short-term projects, lack of exit strategies, and lack of ownership. And all of these are also features of earmarked contributions or projects sponsored by earmarked contributions. So, of course, such effectiveness problems are not unique to the UN, but the UN as a multilateral body exists precisely to provide a different kind of development support that keeps this bilateral interest from donors out. My second point is that earmarking discourages the UN from upstream policy work, and that is kind of the flip side of the first point. And again, let me start by referencing the OECD report. It says that in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, DFIs have a responsibility to shift their focus away from transaction level towards a more forward-looking, transformative and upstream approach. I couldn't agree more, and that certainly also applies to the UN. And to change this would really require a shift in how the UN works. I'm currently writing a briefing paper together with John Handler, former Assistant Secretary General, in which we make the case for a much greater role of the UN in the provision of high-level policy advice. And such a shift is really needed. So there was a study in 2017, the Dahlberg report, that found that just 5% of the UN's resources are spent on policy advice. So if you include related functions like analysis, normative work, and advocacy, then that number would be 21, which is still a very low number. Unfortunately, member states appear to be quite reluctant to embrace upstream policy work. There's an ever greater focus on resource orientation, but the resource, they understand the tangible, quantifiable resource that are suitable to impress ministers and domestic audiences. My third point, the third issue that emerged from our research is that earmarking has to some extent become systemic, at least in the UN, less so in the World Bank. By systemic, I mean that earmarking might no longer reflect specific grievances that donors might have with the UN, such as lack of accountability, transparency, or the wish to sponsor a certain priority, but that earmarking has kind of become self-perpetuating, so part of a vicious circle where earmarking leads to more earmarking. And I mean, when donors use multilateral organizations as implementing partners, then the organizations might in fact embrace these roles as implementing partners. And that means that in the end, they might privilege earmarked resources over core resources, of course, without saying so publicly. So to illustrate this argument, just consider that UN funds and programs mobilize almost all of their earmarked resources at the country level. And that is the result of several decades of decentralization to the field, including the responsibility of resource mobilization. So, but the field office, of course, can only mobilize earmarked funding. It wouldn't make sense to mobilize core resources. And they also have to, because jobs depend on these earmarked contributions. So you see how the structure of the UN, the decentralization, has itself become a driver of earmarking. And that is just one aspect. So this argument of the vicious circle, you can also demonstrate it in other observations. I'll leave it here. The larger point which I want to make is that if the UN wants to attract more core or multilateral resources, I think it also needs to better enact its multilateral value proposition. So which for me would not only include greater effectiveness, more policy advice, but also working more towards or from regional and global public goods in which all member states have a stake. So I'll conclude by pointing out 3 practical recommendations, and each might help to move a bit away from multilateralism a la carte towards a thicker notion of multilateralism. First, it must be ensured that earmarked contributions are fully aligned with and support multilateral programs, and the UN should be able to say no to donors if that is not the case. Second, there needs to be a greater focus on high-level policy advice, and that requires mandates, it requires core funding, but it also requires organizations to adjust their management systems. And third, the UN needs to rebalance towards the global level and orient its work to more directly towards the global common good, however that is defined in various sectors. So these are my opinions. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Max Otto. Now we will have 15 minutes Q&A session. So I would invite participants to send through the chat the questions that you may have, including your name, your organization, and the question that you want to raise. And I will give the floor to the participants so that you can address directly your question to the speaker that you want to ask it. Well, in the meantime, if okay, so we have a first question from Sioba Pilo. If you want, please to take the floor. You are from DFTA Australia, so please go ahead and ask your question. Well, I can read it myself. To what extent is the corporate behavior management systems of the UN or multilaterals responsible for the increasing earmarking trend? Is it fair to put the blame entirely on donors? So I think that would be a question for Max Otto, and I think as well our colleagues from the OECD can answer back as well.
Should I go first? So that is actually two questions. One narrow about the management systems, and the other one more broadly about the responsibility of either donor or UN system. Starting with the narrow question of management systems, so what I refer to is that that organizations have a poor. Wait, sorry. No, let me start with the second question. Responsibility for earmarking. I think it's something like 50-50. So we know that earmarking has not been a great issue and for quite some time. So I mean, it was tabled as a problem, as a real problem, showing up in the boards rather late, when organizations had really been happy and willing to receive earmarked resources for quite a long time. So when we had these high levels of earmarking, it was almost too late that the vicious circle which we described might already have kicked in. So I think that is really a 50-50. And on the first question, I think that is more about the thing of upstream and downstream work. So what I can say about this is that particularly the monitoring and evaluation systems are not really suitable to measure this kind of upstream work. So they have really difficulties capturing this, and this is why organizations tend towards this downstream work as well. It has also to do with human resource policies. So there's been a trend working with consultants which come and go, so the knowledge and the expertise doesn't stay in the UN and go. So that has also been discouraging higher level policy advice.
Yes, if I may add to this, I mean, I think one thing that we try to show in the report is that a lot of these issues have more than one side. You know, it's not just the donor for sure. It's not just the multilateral organizations themselves. It's more in the interaction that creates these issues, and that I think in the early responses that we already see, you know, for example, the UN funding compact or the reform that the World Bank is trying to push for trust funds, that's in its, I think, fourth or fifth phase already. I think they already acknowledge that you know, the problem doesn't come only from one side, and that it's kind of also of a bargain. You know, I think just to mention the UN funding compact, because I think we have a small focus on that in our report. It's quite clear in the way the UN funding compact is presented that, you know, yes, donors commit to reduce their earmarking practices, but on the other side, they also want multilateral organizations to be more transparent, to show more results. And so I think that answers a bit that question. But maybe June and Olivier want to add on that point.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, in Max Otto's presentation, I also found it interesting that you talked about the incentive structure of multilateral organizations and how that leads also to more earmarking from the field. And so I think, yeah, I mean, and also the message in our report was not really to blame anyone for what is happening right now, I think. It's more about, because everyone has very good reasons also to receive more earmark funding and also to give more earmark funding, I think. But what we wanted to do is to have look at the systemic effects of all that and how it impacts on how the multilateral development system is performing overall. So yeah, just to clarify maybe.
Thank you. We have another question from Henriette Heitjer. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing well the last name. Former Deputy Director of the UN MPTF office. And the question is, what questions did you have to have? What questions did you have that you were not able to answer with the current OECD CRS or TOSDI data? And what the OECD planning to address these data gaps? That's a question for the OECD, of course.
Yes, so I mean, I think with the current data, we can already do quite a lot of analysis. I think we can have a good idea of trends. At the same time, we found that there were, if we want to deep dive into certain topics, then maybe the data gets limited. And some of it probably has to do also with the growing complexity of the multilateral system. You know, more actors, it's not only to the traditional actors anymore. And so because non-traditional actors become more and more important, somehow the blind spot we have with the missing data also increases at the same time. So some of the questions, for example, that we would like to look more into that we're not able to really look at is non-traditional donors. So for example, non-DAC countries, we don't have detailed data about their the projects that they fund through the multilateral system. Private actors also, obviously, even though the CRS includes some reporting by private actors, but not all of them. Another example of that is, in recent times, we speak more and more about another role that we want for the multilateral system, which would be to help mobilize funds from the private sector. And this is also an area where we think that more could be done so that we have access to more and better data. So these are a type of examples. And on the second question by Henriette on what the OECD is planning to do to address these questions. So the OECD, through the Development Assistance Committee and the Working Party on Statistics, is already working on some of these questions. So for example, on private finance mobilized by multilateral organizations, that's already a topic of discussion. Another thing that I forgot to mention is also on earmarking. And this is an issue that has already been highlighted, the lack of granular data on earmarking by the countries and the donors themselves, multilateral organizations, researchers. I know that the German Development Institute, DIE, has mentioned this issue. Other researchers before them, such as Bernhard Rensberg from, I think, a university in Zurich. And this is another question that the OECD is also working on right now. Right now, I think in the Working Party for Statistics, they're trying to improve the granularity of the reporting about earmarked funding, looking at the different modalities of funding. And this is also the topic that we chose for one of the policy brief that we prepared on multilateral development finance, which was launched at the same time as the report, where with existing data, we try to do more analysis and more detailed analysis about earmarked funding, but there are some limitations still with the data.
We have here another question to Max Otto. It says, the OECD MDF data suggests that earmarking funding came at the expense of a bilateral ODA, not at the expense of the core funding for the multilateral organizations. So isn't this a call of confidence to the multilateral system away from bilateralism?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, the core funding itself did also not grow. So in the case of the UN, the level of core funding is a flat curve. So it's good that money came from the bilateral side to the UN and has been multilateralized to some degree, but it has not gone into the budgets as core resources. So I'm not sure if that is indicative of confidence in the system. but it's not only confidence that is kind of driving and determining funding to, it's also its usefulness. And I already see the next question here about the supermarket quote. The yuan as it is has tremendous usefulness, obviously, even as a supermarket, as a, I mean, a better kind of term would be something like a shared service provider, much like a car sharing. That can achieve tremendous efficiency gains. And as we know, much of the funding, the new funding for the UN is earmarked funding in humanitarian situations and crisis, emergency funding, and that goes to countries where donors don't have a representation themselves, and so where the UN is much better suited to deliver all of that. So in that regard, the UN is immensely tremendous, but I don't know if that is really a sign of confidence or lack of alternatives, rather.
And regarding your quote on the supermarket, this one last question, you think that this leads to a flight to low need or more high quality competing for the funds, or what do you think that this allegory leads us to?
I'm not sure I understand this question.
It says if you think that this supermarket reference of Achim Steiner is a thing where you feel that you need to do more, or that you need to get more resources to the detriment of quality.
I mean, certainly that also reflects a choice for quantity over quality. And I mean, that came clearly out in our interviews with staff from UNDP and others. So a typical resource mobilization strategy is to do a pilot or so, and then to mobilize for further money to replicate this pilot, but not, I mean, to scale it up and bring it to the levels of policy discussion in the countries, but just to attract more resources. Or you start with a small policy a project, and then you go to the donors and ask for money to implement it, which is less important than the policy change you try to create. So the resource mobilization strategies, I think, if you have a close look, it shows that they are geared towards quantity over quality. Yes.
Thanks. We have time for one last question, also for you, Max Otto. Sorry. What can the EU and its member states do to advocate for policy priorities in the multilateral system? If not through earmarking? This is a question from a team from the German EU Council Presidency support at the GIC.
Yes, it requires mandates. So right now they are negotiating the QCPR, the Quadrennial Comprehensive Policy Review in New York, which gives guidance for the UN development system for the next 4 years. And I've seen the zero draft, and there was almost nothing about policy advice in that. I hope they'll be able to kind of negotiate this into the resolution like in the previous one. So and then also in the boards, I analyzed the strategic plans of the current period and of the last period. And there's a very interesting development. So in the last strategic plan period, that was 2014 to 18, there was quite an emphasis, considerable emphasis on policy advice. It was just not, I mean, implemented. And now in the current strategic plans, that emphasis on policy advice and upstream work has really gone down, significantly gone down. And what I understand from interviews with the organizations is that donors don't have that interest in high-level policy work. They want to see really tangible results. So, I mean, we have the 2030 agenda, all agree there's need for high-level policy advice, integrated solutions, and so on. And at the same time, the attention to this policy advice and the willingness to sponsor it is going down. So a really concerning development.
Thank you. I will close this first Q&A session, and we will start with our second session with Sam Bilal. He's Head of Program Trade, Investment and Finance in the European Center for Development Policy Management. So, Sam, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to participate to this discussion. I wanted to focus in my short intervention on what is the impact of the COVID-19, which is absolutely unprecedented crisis, and how to try to how to respond to the scale of the crisis, and which is also a crisis that is, I mean, it's a shock, but it's also a long-term crisis. So it's there to stay for very long-term impacts. The World Bank is telling us that it will have systemic impact and will be there for for a very long time with us. At least the consequences. We hope that the health issues will be sorted out in the coming months. And what we also know that the resources of donor countries, since it's a global crisis, the resources of donor countries are also captured for their own response. So what we can expect in the future, and that's what also was saying the chair of the DAC group in a meeting earlier this week, is that in fact we should expect aid to be more rationed. And therefore, there would be a need to strategize where ODA should be put on and to do what. And so at a time when and in fact, what would be required, though, in terms of response is especially to help. The last point we know is that the richer countries and the richer people are much better off from the crisis and survive much better from the crisis than the poorer countries and the poorer people. So inequalities is also increasing. So what we would expect is that, in fact, we would have a much stronger response to the COVID crisis in developing countries, which have, in fact, less capacity to respond to it. So it's these moments that ODA and aid is really needed. So when you have such kind of situations, then there is one kind of ways of partly addressing this issue is to try to use ODA to also leverage private finance, and so try to think of a catalytic effect to try to have more financing. And you have institutions that are geared to do that. These are the multilateral development banks and development finance institutions. And so I'm part of a group, the Trihita Karana roadmap for blended finance, where it's a group of stakeholders, including donors, DFIs, and people from think tanks and NGOs, reflecting on what could be done. So a subgroup of us have tried to reflect on what could be the role of DFIs in trying to do this response, because they have the huge potential to help leverage private finance to help address these issues. And one of the concerns also was that, well, we talk, of course, and the macroeconomic responses are very important. It's a lot of the private sector that is hit by the lockdown and by the consequences of the lockdown. And when the private sector is at risk, there was a liquidity problem. Now there is a solvency problem for a lot of the private sector. Then the response, also the financial market is better geared at helping the larger companies, but far less the micro and small and medium-sized enterprises. And so it seemed also to us that the DFIs is the type of institutions that are well equipped to help address the private sector problem. So what they should be doing, and what they have been doing, is to respond extremely fast. So this is quite impressive in terms of their emergency response. They have been very fast at adapting and trying to do what they could do in difficult situations. But what is required from them is to be counter-cyclical, to do much more than what they were doing before. And that's a bit of a challenge, to do more in terms of volumes, to do at scale, but to also do more in terms of sustainability and impact and inclusiveness, because as I mentioned, the inequality is increasing. And so women, some poor segment of the populations will be hardest hit. So how to try to build back better, and to do that in a more effective way. And they have to, we will ask them to do more, but they are themselves faced in the environment which is characterized by much higher uncertainty and much higher risk, including risk of default of their clients. So this is one of the elements that they have to be able to address. And we think that the potential is there, but there's some adjustments that needs to be done. There's a need for much more greater focus and perhaps think about different tools to reach out to this private sector in developing countries, and in particular the micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. This is really a key element, and think about their resilience, and when they do so, to take a very strong gender lens to pursue these things. The second element is to try to not to do that in isolation, and was mentioned also very nicely in the OECD report, is to think about less of simple transactions, but to try to do that in a more transformative way. And if you want to be in a more transformative way, you have really to work a lot with local actors, and you have to work with local institutions. And it's, in that sense, I would, the initiatives of Finance in Common to bring all the public development banks together in a meeting from the 9th to the 12th of November. This is a very good initiative to try to see how the DFIs in more advanced countries can work more also with development, public and private, but normally they tend to focus more on private, but to also include the work with the public and financial institutions with local actors, and to try to see how they could build and support initiatives that are taken by the developing countries, instead of coming by smaller projects that they try to develop completely on their own. And in that sense, try to help and work with donors in developing a pipeline of projects and contribute to project development, and not only trying to compete for whatever the leftovers of bankable projects that are there. And for that, they also need then to be able to have a greater risk capacity, and that might imply different kind of elements. Syndication, so for DFIs to work more together, it's a very effective way to share the risk and to cooperate. So they should do that among themselves, and as I was mentioning, also with local actors. You have various types of risk-sharing mechanisms that could help. Guarantees, so providing guarantees to DFIs and for their clients is really a key issue, and a way that could really be helpfully mobilized. The European Union is providing such kind of guarantees with the European Fund for Sustainable Development and external action guarantees. But the question is, how could that be scaled up and used perhaps more effectively? Increase of capital increase for some of these for some of these DFIs that could, or at least change of their mandate, so they could stretch their balance sheets and use it to greater extent, and when needed to have a capital increase is also another mechanism that would be helpful. A last one that we also looked at and investigated is this question of how you could have some kind of mechanism of balance sheets for the DFIs, and try to create structure or use existing structures that are that could be cooperative, and that would allow to take some of these more risky investments off the balance sheets of the DFIs, and that could be done with the support of donors or with guarantees. So we're thinking about very concrete mechanisms that would allow DFIs to do more, and to do more in a more impactful way through the generic terms of what we call blended finance. And these are some of the elements I think that DFIs, it's really the opportunity now to support their work and to allow them. So in fact, our recommendations are for DFIs, but in particular also for their shareholders. But I'm very pleased to pass the floor to Annalisa Prison, who is the Senior Research Fellow at Overseas Development Institute, because she is also working on the same line of activities in the context of ODI and with ETTG. And I think she can also contribute very nicely with some additional suggestions. Annalisa?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sen. And I will elaborate on a few points specifically on a subset of DFIs, the case of multilateral development banks. But let me start by congratulating the team at the Development Cooperation Directorate at OECD on the latest edition of the Multilateral Development Finance Report. And one of the recommendations is around a greater coordination among the multilateral development finance system, and as a European think tank group, we try to do so from our end. So, as I said, I would like to cover 3 different points on the case of multilateral development banks, emphasizing a couple of points that have already been made. The first one is my take when it comes to the initial response of MDBs to the COVID-19 crisis. Second, I mean, we talked a lot about it. We know that the outlook for bilateral aid is not the most optimistic one. So how can bilateral donors optimize their own resources, and why investing in multilateral development banks is a good option? And finally, how shareholders can support multilateral development banks to fulfill their own mission, especially at a time of economic recovery from the crisis prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So, first point, the implications of the current crisis from the perspective of multilateral development banks. I mean, every organization can do better, but I think that the MDBs so far responded relatively quickly and at scale. I mean, if you're thinking about figures at April this year, we're talking about a commitment of $230 billion US. This is nearly 10 times more than what the bilateral donors have been able to mobilize at that time. Of course, we're talking about the purpose of the MDBs. It's about mobilizing resources at scale, but also bilateral donors were dealing with the first wave of the pandemic at that time. We have some forthcoming analysis at ODI, but just to give you a kind of a flavor, if we're kind of comparing the disbursements across MDBs, actually even individual MDBs, in the first 9 months of this year, the disbursement levels is far greater than the 2019 disbursement. So there's certainly a kind of evidence of kind of greater kind of ability of MDBs to kind of support the recovery stage. But then we have 2 key questions and challenges. I mean, the first one is around the allocation of resources. So to which countries the additional kind of response arrived, and particularly, are those countries most in need financially receiving the largest chunk of resources? And that's why I very much kind of welcome the ask from the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors at the last meeting to increase the kind of information around the allocation. But then there's a second question, which is around the quality of lending. I mean, of course, we are interested in the volume, but also with financing comes policy advice and institutional development. And we know how difficult, it's easy for a seminar for us, but policy dialogue requires presence. And we need to think about the implications long-term of travel restrictions, or trying to think about alternative ways. I'm going to my second point, which is around what's the evidence supporting the investment by bilateral donors into multilateral development banks? The first point, and San already kind of mentioned that, is around leveraging. I mean, investing in MDBs, particularly non-concessional windows, is value for money. I'll give you an example. Over the past 70 years, thinking about the capital the shareholders kind of contributed to the IBRD had been able to kind of lend 40 times more that amount. So I think we need to kind of remember that. And from the perspective of recipient country governments, they prefer working with multilateral organizations because of a kind of a level of trust, but also expertise and policy dialogue. The MDBs are well placed to support global public goods and to finance global public goods, and they tend to be more selective, so to support the poorest countries vis-à-vis bilateral donors. And also an element that is often overlooked, the MDBs stay when the bilateral donors tend to leave. So the graduation from the hard windows from multilateral development banks happen at a very end stage. And to a certain extent, if you think about the period and the need to kind of respond to the crisis with knowledge sharing, peer learning, expertise, the MDBs can play a role to keep the kind of door open, even with upper middle income countries. And that leads me to my very final point. So the evidence is relatively clear that investing in MDBs is a good option for shareholders that will be cash strapped and will have to make some very tough choices. But we also know that many multilateral development banks have kind of front-loaded quite a lot of resources and might hit a wall shortly, particularly in terms of kind of expanding lending from 2022 onwards. And what are the options? I mean, Sen had already kind of alluded to that. I mean, there's one which is doing more with what you have, and the second one is kind of expanding the pie. Doing more with what we have is around reforming the capital adequacy policies. This is a long shot, but thinking about technically, this is kind of work that my colleague at ODI, Chris Sanford, has led over the past few years. But if you're kind of considering also the kind of callable capital from shareholders that have AAA rating or AA plus into the calculations, MDBs as a whole might be able to kind of mobilize an additional $750 billion US. So these are kind of extremely kind of important figures, but we know it will take a while, and shareholders should really start working on that. And the second point is around injecting more resources, and this is kind of the point that San has made. So it's about general capital increase sooner than planned, but also having an interim replenishment rounds for IDA and the ADF. We know that the last round just started, and the next one will be in 3 years. So there's certainly a kind of the need to kind of front load the general capital increases and the replenishment rounds. This is the point I wanted to kind of cover. And now I'm kind of handing the floor to our last but not least speaker, is Fabrizio Botti from the Istituto Affari Internazionali, II. It wasn't just by accident an Italian is kind of handing over to another Italian, but Fabrizio, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Annalise. Let me thank all the series. All the people at the European Think Group and European Center for Development. I am especially grateful for the opportunity to share with you some of the main outcomes of a collective research implemented by the Institute of International Affairs on the European Agenda for Development Finance that I think can be of some interest for this. Between the end of 2019 and March 2020, I managed to produce a task force of experts on the European Agenda for Development Finance. That was in the framework of our strategic partnership with Intesa Sanpaolo. The task force involved experts from the European Investment Bank, the EBRD and the Asian Development Bank, and the academia. Their contributions are collected in a book that will be published by the end of the year. At that time, the European Union was engaged in a major effort to strengthen its institutional architecture for development. As you may remember, in March 2019, the Council of the EU established a high-level group of wise persons on the European financial architecture for development to provide an independent view on how to improve it. But regardless of the European institutional framework's shape, we discussed with European development actors, with experts about key issues in development policies and practice that needed to be addressed in order to better orient EU's coming development efforts. Three potential and also overlapping key areas of intervention were identified as crucial for European development actors, and especially multilateral development banks and DFIs in general. First, the role of the private sector and its ETTGs. Second, climate and green finance. And third, the support to the low-income countries and fragile states. As panelists and colleagues before me have already identified major challenges for multilateral development actors during pandemic and beyond, I will try to focus on the reframing on this main conclusion from our project in a post-COVID-19 perspective by focusing on these three main dimensions with the aim to try to provide concrete recommendation for most effective response to this crisis. A first point, building on concrete examples of cooperation within a region of framework for conditionality in support of private sector project that it emerged as crucial to promote agreement on setting common objectives, achieve coordination between different stakeholders involved in the project, and in successful international development cooperation, especially in the context of high uncertainty as the one that we are living in now. A second point, the changes, the structural changes that are necessary to tackle climate change, both in terms of mitigating the risk of climate change as well as adaptation, political economic consequences as the risk of losers blocking or slowing down the transition are and will be very high. The only way forward is finding just solution from social, economic, and also environmental perspective with two particular groups of challenges that were deemed to be relevant from a development point of view. One, finding new sources of income and livelihood for workers and also regions, macro regions reliant on fossil fuels, and on the other hand, try to manage distributional effects of implementing policies that tackle climate change. The role of multilateral development banks on both issues is crucial, and building just transition consideration into investment, of course, but also in policy frameworks, in supporting the private sector and an environmental sustainable recovery of the economy from the COVID-19 pandemic, of course. One last point, discussion focused also on the role of local private sector in fragile states. Fragile states are all those countries that with conflict-afflicted situation generally characterized political instability, weak governance, economic and social insecurity, and greater vulnerability to the effects of climate change. Discussion also focused on how the multilateral agency should engage in such a specific development process and context, and the condition in which the private sector can represent an ideal partner for development actors, multilateral development actors in this context of fragility. Some of the contextual factors affecting least developed countries in 2020 beyond the sphere of intervention of multilateral development actors, such as, for example, violence, corruptions, but others may represent a serious challenge for development finance, such as, for example, poor business enabling environment, distortions on foreign aid dependence, weak legal and regulatory framework. They are all limiting private sector growth, and remarkable case studies help to identify at least one critical aspect for cooperation success in fragile states. One is project ownership to participatory community, foster a common ownership and also responsibility for local projects. I think I leave the stage to our moderator, Maria Alejandra Llano, Research Fellow for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda of the Institute for Sustainable Development and international relations. I leave to you, Maria, for the introduction of a second Q&A round. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fabrizio, and thank you all for this second session. So we will have again 15 minutes. I will ask participants to send the questions through the chat, or if you want to address directly the question to any of the speakers, please turn on your cameras and ask for the floor, and I will give it to you. Thank you. So we have one first question to San. Is building on Annalisa's point on allocation, with only 6% of blended finance going to LDCs compared to the 4% of FDI to developing countries flowing spontaneously to LDCs. Is it mainly windfall effect, or is it a true game changer? What do you think, Sam?
Okay, perhaps it's mentioned that blended finance is not the only solution. I think I mean, that was the focus of the discussion, but the big issue for, in particular for low-income countries now, but also for even some middle-income countries, is the debt issue. So I think there will not be a game changer if we don't address the debt issue. But here, this is not the topic of the conversation. But what is clear, I mean, you know, I sometimes call myself as being friends of blended finance and friends of DFI, because I think these are kind of great instruments, great potential, and then I have exactly this frustration that why are we not able to do more? And in particular, if we think about, so I think there's a problem of, you know, some are saying blended finance should not happen in lower income countries or in poor countries. I think that's wrong. I mean, there are opportunities because there's a private sector, more informal, but there's a private sector also in poorer countries. And that is by working with this private sector that the countries are going to develop. So I think to think that only ODA, of course, the larger share of ODA should go to poorer countries, but to think that only ODA should go to poorer countries is wrong. The second, of course, is this notion of sometimes numbers, but Olivier knows that better than me. You have sometimes just, you know, you spend more on more advanced economies with larger markets and when you have larger infrastructures and so on than you do in poorer economies with smaller economic markets. So the numbers can be biased. But I think fundamentally the issue is that DFIs are not well equipped to work. You know, IFC is better, but even IFC that has for instance, IDA private sector window to work in poorer countries has difficulties to spend the money. So they have the money, they have the tools there, and then they have difficulties to spend as much as they could. So that's why there's a need to rethink a bit the approach. And I think in principle, Europe is in the good track to do so with the external investment plan, for instance, to think how to better combine blended finance with guarantees to help DFIs go in markets where they would not go otherwise, to provide technical assistance to accompany these elements, and to work at the same time on the business environment and investment climate. And so try to articulate all the tools of development corporations together to work better in synergy. So the principles are good, but we are not achieving. We're not going at scale, and we're not doing at impact. That's why we were suggesting of, you know, more concrete ways of trying to do that at scale, because this is really needed. It's a question of, you know, it's a very critical question at the time of COVID. It's not just a nice to do, it is absolute necessity now.
Thanks, San. I have a question to the OECD colleagues, actually. It says, you touched upon on the effectiveness of development with the multilateral system outperforming bilateral donors. on development effectiveness indicators based on the GPEDC monitoring survey. Could you please elaborate on the main dimensions and comparison between multilateral institutions?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the analysis has been provided by colleagues from GPEDC, and from what I know, I mean, they're looking into different performance measured as from data that is collected from the recipient countries, so the partner countries, and it's based on their responses to survey questions on how multilaterals or bilaterals are performing in terms of the different indicators. So we have talked about predictability. We have also alignment with national systems and the use of national indicators in their data. And then also the involvement of partner governments in the evaluation and monitoring of their programs. So in almost all of those dimensions, I think multilaterals are outperforming bilaterals, as we said, but these are average values. So I think, Annalisa, you're pointing to the differences within and across multilateral organizations. So yeah, there are some differences. So for example, in terms of alignment with national systems and the use of public finance systems from the partner governments, I believe the multilateral development banks have been outperforming the other multilateral organizations. But and then on other indicators, I think the UN system has been superior. But and overall, there are also some individual entities that are outperforming the average values. But what we wanted to point out is that consistency across most of the dimensions, multilaterals have higher performance than bilaterals.
Thanks. I have a question on my own, actually. Yesterday, we launched at EDRI a study that touches upon how public development banks or DFIs are actually introducing the 2030 agenda into their daily operations and practices. And it's interesting of what Sam mentioned about considering himself a friend of DFIs. I think I am myself one. I would like to ask you if you think, for example, that multilateral development banks are still being too conservative due to the fact that credit rating agencies have an important say in the ratings that they receive, and this in a way makes them a little bit adverse to risk. And what would you think would be the solution? We were thinking about introducing maybe an SDG credit score in the case of Sustainable Development Goals. But what sort of other options do you think, if you consider that these agencies might be a pitfall for multilateral institutions and the entire system to be a little bit more ambitious and be able to invest in more fragile settings?
The question is addressed to me. I would, well, yes. Perhaps because I think it's not the MDBs that are too conservative, it's the shareholders of the MDBs and DFIs that are too conservative. So I would like to put the onus on those those governments that tell MDBs and DFIs what to do. And then MDBs and DFIs operate within these constraints. But I could answer, but I think a lot of your questions, in fact, Annalisa probably. I will turn to Annalisa and also, I mean, perhaps talk about the work of Richard on stretching the balance sheets. And she mentioned that already in her presentation. Annalisa, you want to address some of these issues?
Let me just make a couple of points, and we are kind of running out of time. I agree with Sam. I mean, that comes from the shareholders. There are also parts within the multilateral development banks, not necessarily the policy part, but mainly the kind of treasury departments. I mean, the fact that the MDBs are conservative should also be analyzed in light that the AAA rating that they have, that's the key element, is the main element that allows lending at very kind of competitive rates, or at least kind of far lower rates than what many countries might be able to kind of obtain in the international capital markets. So it's a kind of a responsibility across shareholders, part of the MDB management. And also there are the credit agencies, but they're not necessarily the kind of the main kind of responsible ones. There's a kind of an element related with the fact that the MDBs are assessed as if they were a kind of a commercial company, and you know that the kind of diversification that the MDBs, because they work with countries, I'm talking about multilateral development banks, not the DFIs, the concentration is far greater, and therefore also the risk. So shared responsibilities, but as I said in the intervention, it's a long shot. It will take a lot of kind of negotiation, but there's certainly a kind of an area where shareholders and MDB management should be kind of focusing on in the next years, especially to kind of expand the lending capacity.
Thank you. I will have just one last question that I couldn't ask you before the first Q&A, and then I will give each of you 1 last minute for some final remarks. This question is from Mariana Fati of Vigeo 80s, and she asks if maybe focusing on beneficiaries, do you consider that having more engagement with local stakeholders such as civil society organizations and governments can be used as a tool to have a better dialogue with them on the side of multilateral development institutions and help overcome the earmarking issues, for example? So I think it's Max Otto who can answer this, but also all of you if you want to take the floor as well.
Well, since Max Otto is not speaking, I think this is really a key point. And in that sense, I'd like to highlight, I mean, I've been working on these issues, but I'd like to highlight on blended finance, the practical guidance that have been developed by the OECD in consultation with many stakeholders on this principle 3 on blended finance, which is about how to engage with local stakeholders. This is really key, and I think because of, I mean, by definition, DFIs always talk to local stakeholders, government or private sector, but it is, you know, there's a transaction cost, and sometimes it is perceived as something a bit difficult to go, you know, to go too far. And there's the way they engage is really depends on the type of DFIs. But so what they were trying to do in this practical guidance is to highlight the benefits of engaging with local actors for the ownership, the sustainability of the action. To help sometimes even drive some of the projects, and trying to build on better practices that, you know, is conducted by some of the MDBs and DFIs, and that is really really key. I will as soon as I've finished, I will look for the link to share in the chats of this work that was very nicely compiled by the OECD.
Should I briefly comment on this question also? I don't think local stakeholders have much to do with the question of earmarking or not. They are beneficiaries of the funding, so it doesn't matter what source the funding comes from. It's a bit different if you define local stakeholders also as governments, host governments. Then yes, for example, you could have you could involve donors also in the making of UN programs that last for 4 years, and then form a greater consensus on what is to be done in order to incentivize earmarking at a higher level, at the level of the program rather than individual projects.
Thank you. So now I will give each of the speakers 1 last minute for closing remarks, and then we will do a wrap up of the event. So please, Olivier, you can start.
Thank you. No, but I will let my colleagues conclude. But just for me to say thanks a lot. For the discussion, and I will let them conclude. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for a great discussion. From my side, there's one issue that has been mentioned by 3 of the speakers, by my colleague Zioun, by Annalisa, by Fabrizio also, I think, which is the issue of coordination. And since that's also one of the recommendations that we had in our report on how to improve the current system, I think I'd like to add on a little bit on that note. We've heard a lot through the surveys, we've conducted, that this was a key issue during the crisis in the multilateral response, both coordination among donors of the system and also coordination among multilateral agencies themselves. But we've also heard, that in some way, this crisis required a lot of coordination because of its nature between actors that were not maybe used to work together, maybe UN agencies working on health, MDBs that had, and so one homework I think for us is also to try to draw the lessons from this crisis and see in terms of coordination what has worked, what hasn't worked, to try to improve the system and ensure it's ready for the next crisis. Thank you.
I will use my last word to draw attention to the policy brief on earmarked funding that was published alongside with the main report. It's really an excellent policy brief, and it comes with an innovation, and that is the more granular depiction of earmarked funding. So you distinguish between project and program funding, country level and global level. And I asked myself, so why didn't the UN come up with that much earlier? So the UN has one category, it's program and prospect-specific funding, and all of that is called tightly earmarked funding. But in reality, you have in this broad category, you have the good, the bad, and the ugly versions of earmarked funding. And it's very important to differentiate between these, first of all, for us, so that we can do better research, but also to be able to regulate this earmarked funding better and incentivize, push donors more towards the softly earmarked program funding, and at the same time reduce the ugly versions of earmarking. Yep.
Well, I would like to build on what Max Otto was saying in his presentation on the fact there is perhaps not enough upstream and policy analysis and perspective from a global public good dimensions. And on this, I really would like to congratulate, but absolutely genuinely, the OECD. This is really what the OECD is doing in this multilateral system. And fantastic work, and also since we talked, I talked on the role of blended finance, they have brought also under this Trihita Karana working group on blended finance a really multi-stakeholder capacity of bringing people from different perspectives to try to bridge this divide between the knowledge and the action, and try to see how to do that. And this is an absolutely fantastic work that they are doing. So I just would like to congratulate. And the reports, the MDF report is one of the examples of just the fantastic resources that OECD is doing and the capacity to bring people together. So I just wanted to finish on this note, because I think this is exactly what we need, especially at the time of crisis with COVID-19. We need this capacity to bring the best knowledge available and to translate that into action.
I might kind of sound a broken record, but I would like really to re-emphasize the policy recommendations on the space of MDBs. We know that the financing challenge is big going forward. The MDBs play a small role financially, but still quite an important role, bearing in mind the effectiveness dimension, the leveraging effect, but also because we know that bilateral donors are not expected to kind of increase their budgets, at least in the next couple of years, if they ring-fence them. And so there's a kind of a real urgency to kind of start what we debated as well in the Q&A, a reform of the capital adequacy rules, but also to seriously kind of push ahead with a general capital increase. It happened in 2010, right after the global financial crisis. And also we shouldn't kind of wait another 2 years to move into the replenishment rounds for the sub-windows of multilateral development banks. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Given my position of last intervention before the concluding remarks from the moderator, let me add something on the possible future steps together. The Institute of International Affairs is going to co-chair the next Team 20 process under the Italian presidency of the T20 in 2021. The Institute will organize and manage 5 thematic task forces. One of them is a task force on the Agenda 2030 and development cooperation. We hope you will have the opportunity to participate, to contribute to policy brief and other activities we are going to organize in 2021. Thanks again.
And sorry, I think I missed my entry point before, but I wanted to thank everyone very much because I very much enjoyed the discussion and I learned a lot. And also, as we proposed in our report, the reform agenda that we propose for multilaterals is also a research agenda for ourselves. And we would like to continue this discussion and this collaboration with all of you to do more about the research on this front. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. And just to conclude and wrap up, I think that as we look to build back better from this COVID-19 crisis, these discussions that we had today on how multilateral finance can do more and can play an even more stronger role are a chance to deliver on innovative responses that really help us set the world on track for a sustainable recovery. I think it is key to ensure that financial flows really contribute to accelerate the transformations that we need to rebuild our economies, to decarbonize our economies, but also to reduce the inequalities and the vulnerabilities that this crisis has not only evidenced, but exacerbated as well. And it's clear from the study that was presented today and from what the speakers shared with us that the role of multilateral finance is very important and that it can still do much more. I think it's also important to highlight that we should perhaps avoid earmarking that is a straitjacket to limit responses and actions that are needed by governments and local recipients. And it should be important to find a balance between these now trending sort of funding with more core funding that allows really flexibility to implementers to really have an impact on the ground. And finally, we as European think tanks and as a group are speaking for all of us, are very happy to have hosted this event, this first series of events that the OECD is going to have regarding these publications, that we think it's very useful for future discussions and to dig more on the role of multilateral development finance and of the role that they can play to help us sort this crisis and recover better. Thanks a lot to participants that join us in this discussion for your questions, and I hope you liked the discussions that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.